Welcome back. You're watching The Fix with me, Karima Brown. I'm in conversation with William Bird and John Mattison, and we are, of course, discussing the crisis at the public broadcaster. William, the big question is what financial model must be followed to make the SABC sustainable? The board chair has been on this channel and everywhere else saying that they simply don't have the money. They will have to cost cut. Workers are saying, and journalists are saying, why are you cutting us? And why are you not cutting the fat at management level? We saw the salaries, for example, that was released of employees from board, or rather executive level down. The salaries are quite high if you compare them in terms of the industry. What sustainable model is on the table for a public broadcaster, which essentially is getting its main tranche of money from a government that really doesn't have, anything in the kitty, so to speak? I mean, the government is bankrupt.
Exactly, so the ANC is caught between a rock and not the ANC, the SABC and the ANC for that matter, actually. But the SABC is caught between a rock and a hard place to the extent that they're told, you have to cut costs. You must run it as a new, efficient digital organization. They say, okay, and then they say, well, no, you can't do any of that. But we aren't going to give you a bailout, unlike the SAA, which it seems, they drop a hat and they get another few billion rand, which doesn't serve the interests of all people or the majority of people, unlike the SABC, which actually does. So you have to say that ultimately the cause of this is that government doesn't take the SABC seriously. The only time they think about it and the only time they get angry and upset about it is when there's a threat and when they're not doing what they want them to do, fundamentally. And this is the real issue here, because the ANC, several conferences ago said we have to make sure that there's greater public funding for the public broadcaster because of the fact that its commercial public funding model is simply unsustainable. Now, to government's credit, over the recently they issued a draft white paper on audio-visual content, etc., etc., and in there are some proposals that talk about funding, the SABC in particular in a very different way. Now, these are really positive steps. They're 15 years late, but they are positive steps. But they're also not going to happen within the next, being conservative, 3 to 5 years. So if you look at that, you've got to say, well, how does the SABC possibly sustain itself in that next 3 to 5 year period while we look and find legitimate ways of properly resourcing the SABC's public mandate? Because let's be clear, the SABC is absolutely critical to our country if we are to remain a democratic state. And so this kind of fight at the moment, this repeat of that pattern that John pointed out just before the break, is absolutely fundamental to this. You have to say, why are these people getting angry and upset about this now? If they were to take this SABC crisis seriously, when Mr. Magashule was interviewed, he would have said, look, we strongly oppose retrenchments. We support the workers against this, but we need to respect the views of the board. They have a job to do. We're going to stand back and allow them to do this, and we will see how we support as the ANC and see what things we can do in government to encourage a better reform model. Something along those lines, not this nonsense of, well, they're our deployees, we must go and tell them what to do. It shows that this is about, for them, an issue of control and not a serious effort to find a genuine funding model, alternative. And that, I think, is the most worrying element. So we know we've been talking about a funding model for the last 15, 20 years about the SABC. The fact that it hasn't happened is because those in political power don't want to let it happen, because then they would lose that real lever of financial control over the SABC.
Now, John, the IFP has called for an urgent debate on the crisis at the SABC. I watched the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee discussion, in the build-up to Friday. And I must say I was extremely disappointed with the quality of the debate amongst the MPs. I mean, they were grandstanding grandstanding. They were, having tiffs with each other instead of discussing very real issues like, for example, viable funding models, because we know that government doesn't want to spend money on the SABC, but also the SABC's own model doesn't bring enough revenue in. So obviously cuts will have to happen, but Parliament isn't necessarily in a position to guide this process either, because there we've had, people literally swaying as the political fortunes of particular figures in the African National Congress, wane or rise. I mean, during the Zuma era, the committee was essentially a lapdog. And then, of course, with the Ramaphosa era, you have a kind of free-for-all. I mean, is a parliamentary debate, snap debate, on this matter going to get us to how to solve the financial crisis at the SABC, or is it just going to allow politicians to grandstand again?
Well, I fear the latter, Karima, but the underlying problem with this is that our Parliament and government don't get into the details and don't really listen to go into an institution like the SABC. And when I was writing my book, Cyril's Choices, I discovered it. Institution after institution, it's the same thing. There are solutions. By the way, you said in the beginning that the government is providing most of the funds. Historically, government provided almost no funds to the SABC, and it managed. Now, things have got tougher even before COVID-19, so I accept it's complicated. But there are solutions, among them the fact that when we get, up until very recently, and possibly still, SABC provides its channels to DSTV and others at little or no revenue, and that's because of a screw-up with the regulator, ICASA. If you solve those things, channel fees can be a considerable source of income. And there are other things which we don't have time to go into now. But if politicians really want to solve it, they should sit down and ask questions instead of answering them. The first thing is to know what you don't know. There are solutions in the SABC. Obviously, government funding, additional government funding would always be welcomed. But even within where we are, if you build an efficient SABC, there are revenue streams that are possible. Of course, they don't take you as far as you want to go, it's true, but there are solutions. My worry is, as you described at the committee, if a parliamentary committee, if it goes to Parliament, it'll become over-politicized. People are concerned. There's an election coming in the local elections next year, and that's why they don't want to see retrenchments.
Okay, John, hold that thought. I want to bring William in. William, you're nodding vigorously. We're talking about channel funds that could be one way in which the SABC can become sustainable. What other options are there? And how are broadcasters abroad doing it, public broadcasters, whether you look at the Germans, whether you look at the Canadians? Are there best practices that the SABC can borrow from to put a concrete plan on the table instead of, the political gamemanship that we're seeing at the moment?
So, look, I think that like many other public broadcasters around the world, you're going to have to look at it at a mixed revenue kind of model. You've got to look at in the UK, they've got license fees, but they went through a massive restructuring and retrenched thousands of jobs in there. And theirs is a really incredibly well-resourced public broadcaster. So you've got to look at the fact that increasingly the SABC will face more challenges and less revenue because of growing Facebook, Google, etc., and threats from Netflix in terms of local content programming. So everything is stacked up against the public broadcasters, so they have to find ways. We did see, I think it was last week or the week before, SABC has announced some kind of a deal with Telkom to be carrying their content, so that's one of the ways that they can start to bring in an alternative revenue for the SABC. But you do need to look at saying, well, is there some kind of a public fund? Can you have a public service content levy, for example, that would replace the TV license? These kinds of ways of raising it. As John points out, there are lots of answers. We're very good at finding answers to difficult problems in South Africa. It's allowing the institutions that are actually responsible for them to go and implement the damn things. And for government, as John said, to support that, to ask questions and then stand back and let them do these things. The moment they intervene with them, you're into a disaster.
Okay, so now the big thing that has obviously caught people's imagination is the fact that 400 workers are set to be retrenched, and, you know, people are talking about a jobs bloodbath. But let's face it, the media in South Africa has gone through that. You've seen radio station like Kaya FM, for example, sacking 38 people, 702. You know, I don't even know what to call the radio station anymore because it's gone through several iterations, but certainly it has issued Section 189s. A whole range of organizations have done so. People have taken salary cuts. Why must the SABC be any exception, John? I mean, that's just what is happening in the market.
Among the things that this debate from the political side doesn't address is what I discovered when I got into the SABC, that for at least the whole of the Zuma period and maybe even longer, every year the salaries were increased by well above inflation. Well, if you understand compound interest, you know that after 10 years, you have a lot of people who are getting far more than they would get in the market in any alternative or commercial company for doing the same work. So the salary bill has got out of kilter. Now, somehow that's got to be corrected, whether it's a combination of retrenchment or salary freezing or whatever. But I never see anybody among the political class saying, okay, we accept that these mistakes have to be fixed.
Okay, John, let me bring in William. We're running out of time. William, we know that under Hlaudi, jobs were created and inflated. We have, for example, a position at the SABC called studio specialist. My understanding is when they tried to find out what the job specs of a studio specialist was, they couldn't find it. But apparently there are people who are studio specialists, and no one knows what that job actually holds. We know that a union like the Communication Workers Union actually fed off the largesse of the Hlaudi era. They endorsed his pillage of the public broadcaster. They are now standing out front, campaigning supposedly for the rights of workers. But a lot of their members benefited directly from jobs that were created for PALs under Hlaudi. How seriously should we take a union such as the Commercial Workers Union when they say they're fighting for jobs at the SABC?
I would sooner take the views of a rubber chicken more seriously than CWU for precisely the reasons you've articulated. You know, when there were threats against the SABC 8, did the CWU go out and march against them? Hell no, they stayed silent. When Maguve and all of the wrongdoing that was openly, actively going on at the board there, did they call for the dissolution of that board? No, they did not. Did they go and give testimony and demand to be seen and heard in Parliament and represent the views of the CWU, of the workers? No, they did not do that. So now suddenly, and again, this comes down to what did they stand to benefit? What's the political gain in CWU suddenly now deciding that they actually need to represent workers? You know, because clearly they didn't do that in the past. So what makes them decide to do it now? And it also means we should have no reason at all to trust anything that they say.
Okay, gentlemen, that is obviously a discussion that we are going to take further. We are waiting for comment from the board. As I said, they are not speaking for the next 7 days. We will, of course, try and speak to the board chair as soon as that moratorium is up. Still ahead, should Jacob Zuma be charged with contempt and arrested for showing the middle finger to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture? Stay with us.